Dear God, we ask that our time might be well spent as we enjoy this community and all it offers. May this time also be fruitful and rich as well. Amen. So in this morning's text, we have Jesus and his disciples in Jericho. They started on their way up to Jerusalem on the Jericho road. It's kind of steep, but many are following along, and they're on the way. They run into a number of other folk, among them a blind beggar. Oh, it's Bartimaeus, someone groans, by which we gather he's well known. Then he begins shouting, and we find the source of his reputation. He's shameless. He doesn't care a bit what other people think of him. And so he shouts all the more, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And with that special form of address, a hush comes over the crowd. Son of David? Is this blind man calling Jesus the Messiah? Well, in a moment, that's forgotten. Someone says, "Be quiet, beggar. Have you no shame? Don't be hustling this rabbi for loose change." Jesus reacts differently. He says, "Call him." And the scolding of Bartimaeus ceases immediately. Encouragement replaces it. "Get up," says one. "Take heart," says another. And Bartimaeus doesn't merely rise. He flings off his cloak, leaps to his feet, runs toward the place he imagines Jesus' voice coming from, and stands expectantly right in front of Nathanael, the disciple who smiles and turns the blind man by his shoulders in Jesus' direction. Or we might surmise that happened. Jesus asks, "What do you want me to do for you?" Which seems like a rhetorical question, but Jesus is quite serious. He wants to give the man agency here, as he always does. He wants to hear from Bartimaeus' own lips exactly what he wants. And Bartimaeus then sums up his heart's desire in 6 words, "Rabbi, give me my sight." And Jesus says, "Go, your faith has made you well." Just like that. No mud, no healing spittle on his eyelids, not even a touch on the forehead. Still, it appears to be enough. Bartimaeus closes his eyes for a long moment, and when he opens them, the story tells us they work. Is this what we ourselves would want, I wonder? To trade in whatever form of blindness each of us has for new sight, so that we can see ourselves, see the world clearly without cloud or shadow. Is that really what we would want? Many decades ago, when Western surgeons perfected the technique of doing cataract removals, they ranged across Europe and America, doing them on people who'd been blind due to cataracts from birth. A psychologist named Marius von Senden collected the accounts, publishing them in 1932 in a book called Space and Sight. And it's quite fascinating. The vast majority of patients, male and female alike, had no idea of space whatever. Distinct form and size were totally meaningless to them. The idea of distance was equally meaningless. They confused it with roundness. Think about it. One doctor gave his patients a sphere and a cube before the surgery, asking them to identify the objects. They did this either by feel or by running their tongues over the objects. Then, after successful surgery, he showed the same objects to them without letting them touch or taste them. They had no idea what they were looking at. They had no notion of size either. In one case, a patient saw her mother across the room, asked how big she was. The patient held her fingers a few inches apart. For another, a boat on a lake was considered about 2 inches long. The sense of a house a mile away was that it was close. It just required many steps to get to. The idea that a chair in a room could obscure a dog made absolutely no sense to them at all. Either it was there in plain sight or it wasn't there at all. What they did see immediately was color. For some, this was rapturous, but not for all. What they could not identify was shadow. One newly sighted girl looked at photographs and paintings. "What are those dark patches?" she asked. Her mother said, "Those aren't dark patches, those are shadows. It's the way the eye knows things have shape. If not for shadow and shining brightness on objects, everything would look flat." And the girl said, "But everything does look flat." Another girl was taken out to look at a tree. She remarked with delight that it had lights in it. The leaves were shining. I remember the moment at age 13 when I got my first pair of glasses. The postman who was on foot that day brought them to me while I was mowing the lawn. I remember how each individual blade of grass just shone for me. I also remember that it was actually hard to see so much all at once. I experienced a sudden sensory overload. The mental effort necessary to make sense of this world was too much for many of the newly sighted people in the study I just mentioned. The tremendous size of the world was oppressive to them. Before, it had been touchingly manageable. It was also difficult for them to fathom the news that they themselves had been so visible to others when they were blind, sometimes unattractively so, without their knowledge or consent. A disheartening number of them refused to use their new vision at all, continuing to navigate by touch or by tongue. One father of a 20-year-old girl who received her sight wrote that his daughter carefully shuts her eyes whenever she wishes to go about the house, especially when she comes to a staircase, and that she is never happier than when, by closing her eyelids, she lapses back into her former state of blindness. Several said they'd rather go back to being blind than having their sight. Imagine, after being rescued from a life in the dark, after being hauled into a world of color, depth, and movement, to want to give that up. To think that there might be too much to see, too much to do, too much more to learn, too much maybe to be. To think that it was better before, when the world was smaller, quieter, more easily managed. It's said that there is a unique serenity available to the blind that is just not available to the rest of us. To be able to sit in the familiar dark, where all the edges are rounded off, where one feels hidden, where one need only concern oneself with what is immediately in one's reach. The story of Bartimaeus is the story of a man who chooses to exchange his darkness for a world of sight, a world of challenge, a world where being a disciple of Christ is an option, a world beyond what I called the familiar dark. What is our familiar dark? That's a funny term. I'm really just talking here about blind spots. We all have them, you know. You'll remember the old East Indian parable. 6 men in a village are led to a public square where they observe an elephant. It's their first experience with one. All of them have been blind since birth. An elephant is like a great pillar, says one of them who puts his arms around the elephant's leg. No, says another, scoffing. An elephant is like a snake. He's the one who's been clutching the beast's long tail, of course. No, says the third, the elephant is like a huge tropical bush. He's the one holding a gigantic elephant's ear. The blind men begin to argue, everyone believing he is right. And then the man who's led them to the square calmly explains, "You're all correct. Everyone noticed something different because each of you touched a different part. The elephant has all the features that you mentioned." Well, our reality is, of course, like the elephant. Everyone observe parts of it, right? That's why others can see aspects of the world that we miss, and of course, vice versa. The problem with blind spots is that we don't know what we don't know, right? To get the whole picture of anything, we need to consider other people's perspectives, of course, not just our own. Warren Buffett once said, "What the human being is best at doing is in interpreting all new information so that their prior conclusions remain intact." You get it? For instance, social media has sealed us into totally insulated worlds, right? Facebook, Instagram, X, Snapchat all use algorithms to send us memes that agree with our politics. We no longer have Walter Cronkite, who strove to give us unbiased reporting from the political center. Now we can tune into the news that will pander to what we want to hear. That's not healthy, right? Do we all agree? For them, it's a no-lose situation. I mean, if Donald Trump wins the presidency, MSNBC stands to gain back a ton of viewership they lost when Joe Biden won in 2020, right? It goes the other way too. Fox News gains viewership when Democrats win. Angry people look for more selective political content than happy people. The system therefore legitimizes lies and prejudice, scorn and division by definition, all because we love our familiar dark. Example. Back in 2017, early in that year, you remember we had a new president who was elected on a platform that was all about closing our borders and a promise to round up immigrants. Well, about 100 of us more progressive church folk living in Salt Lake City gathered at a Unitarian church to figure out together what it would take to defend people of color in our valley from summary deportation. I was sitting next to a woman who identified herself as a freelance journalist. She rose to say that ICE, the immigration police, was stalking Mexican men in parking lots of Hispanic markets all around our town. She'd seen this herself and was calling it out. It sounded egregious as she described what she was witnessing. Well, rather than stay at the meeting, I got in my car and headed to the Hispanic market in my neighborhood, Rancho Market, to check it out myself. I found the manager of the store right by the checkout as I entered, and I asked him if ICE agents were terrorizing his customers in his parking lot. He didn't even pause. He knew that what I was talking about and said that what the freelance journalist had likely seen in his parking lot were bail bondsmen approaching car doors of patrons, asking them if they or any members of their family or friends might be in jail and in need of bailing out. He said they did this all day long. They weren't ICE agents at all. The new president had only been in office a couple of months, and we liberal types were looking for trouble. We were looking for a fight. Well, trouble was indeed coming, as we now know. Plans were already being hatched to separate would-be immigrant children from their parents. But we were overeager to pounce, and our vision was impaired by our bias and our anger and our worry. We had huge blind spots to overcome. Let me broaden this discussion briefly before I close. Sometimes our blind spots are even deeper. Most often they're personal, right? Sometimes they're connected to conditions inside ourselves that we have, in fact, suppressed, though we don't even know it. This is common to all of us. Here's a true story from a man named Bruce from Portland. He writes, When our child was born, my wife and I were immediately caught up in the euphoria of being first-time parents and couldn't stop marveling over this new human being we'd brought into the world. We had little immediate family around to help us out, so our excitement was soon tempered by exhaustion. 6 weeks later, my mother came for a short visit. I was eagerly anticipating some much-needed rest, but she showed almost no interest in playing with or holding our baby. Watching my mother board the plane home and reflecting on how the weekend had gone, I thought to myself, I guess she just isn't a kid person. And then I realized, for the first time, she never was. The writer Doreen Virtue has written, each of the painful problems in our lives contain valuable healing lessons. They teach us awareness and hopefully convince us to let go of our blind spots, our prejudices and tendencies to ignore our intuition and other growth lessons that are right there. People, you and I, we can wake up, but it often takes a willingness to endure personal pain, as in the case of Jesus asking blind Bartimaeus if he really, really wants to see again. Seeing is not a straightforward proposition. You know this already. What have your rough patches taught you? What blind spots vanished for you when something happened to clear your sight? Were you happy about it? Or did you maybe find yourself longing for the familiar dark that you had lost or relinquished? What other blind spots, I wonder, might remain for us? Marcel Proust put it this way: the real voyage of discovery in living consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. Amen.